Hello, I'm Jonathan Chevalier, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Charity Digital News webinar. We're back in our London base this week after a month on the road, delivering webinars in conjunction with Microsoft from their offices. If you've joined us before, it's great to have you back, and if it's your first webinar with us, then I hope it's the first of many. And this week, I'm really delighted to welcome back Cub from the National Cyber Security Centre. Cub has a 7-year history in charities onto which he's added real expertise in cybersecurity. And this is our third webinar with him. The first session in January was an introductory session, and the March session was on the 5 steps every charity should take to improve their cybersecurity. Those sessions have had great reviews, and I'm really pleased that we can actually delve a little bit deeper today into what is such an important but ultimately quite deep topic as well. In terms of us, Charity Digital News, we're run by Tech Trust, and we're a charity that's totally focused on helping other charities to improve their impact through the use of digital technology. And we use these free of charge webinars as a way to up the skill levels across the sector. We've been exploring a whole range of different topics. So as well as cybersecurity, we've had sessions on social media, digital leadership, our Microsoft Skills Month, and we'll also be looking at areas like fundraising as well. The next session coming up in a week's time, so also in our normal Thursday afternoon 1 o'clock slot, is in conjunction with Lightful, and that's on leveraging the power of personalization in social media. Our other sessions with them have had great reviews and big audiences, so do please join us for that as well. In terms of other things we do in Tech Trust, we run TT Exchange, and that's a program that can provide you with access to discounted and donated technology from major technology companies. We run TT Mail, which is a white labeled email service using the .mailer platform. So if you maybe find MailChimp a bit frustrating and limiting at times, you'd find TT Mail a really great service. And we also run Charity Digital Jobs, which is what it says on the tin, really. In terms of today's webinar, we'll be recording it, and we'll put that recording live within the next week. So if you want to refer back to it or share it with your colleagues, it'll be there for you. And we're back on our normal Zoom platform this week. Not anticipating any difficulties, but if there are any issues, just stay online and refresh your screen. In terms of Q&A, we'll be using our normal format, which is to answer questions at the end, but do please log the questions as you go along using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And one ask, your feedback's really, really important to us, and we use it to improve future webinars and shape their direction. So after the webinar, you'll be receiving a questionnaire from us. It's only got a few questions, and it should take less than 2 minutes to complete, but do please do it. As I say, your feedback's really important to us. So I think that's all I want to say by way of introduction, and I'd like to now hand over to Cub, who's going to talk about the risk management approach to cybersecurity.
Thanks, Jonathan. Before we begin on today's content, I'd just like to kind of recap what we've covered in webinars 1 and 2, because they are quite relevant to what we're going to cover today. So in webinar 1, we covered essentially the threat to charities. So why charities are at risk, and simply put, because charities hold funds, they hold commercial data, financial data and personal data, sometimes in very large volumes. And all of those things have a financial value to criminals. We covered who charities are at risk from, and unfortunately there is a reasonably long list of people that potentially have something to gain from committing cyber attacks against charities. But the most prevalent one, and the one that we've tried to focus on through this series of webinar, is the threat from cyber criminals, who are simply kind of those motivated by money, who think that by either stealing data and using that to further sort of criminal enterprises, or by committing sort of cyber-enabled bank mandate fraud, for example, those kind of things where they are ultimately just trying to steal money from people, a lot of the time not realizing that you are actually a charity at all. but unfortunately still committing attacks that could well affect charities. And we have seen that over the last couple of years that our charity team has been established at NCSC. We covered how charities are being attacked. There is a sort of variety of attacks that we've seen. Some of the more typical ones that you would expect to see. So those phishing emails that are either trying to get you to click on links, download attachments that perhaps have malicious software in them, or they're being used to sort of socially engineer your staff, perhaps, and quite commonly in the finance department, to try and get them to pay malicious invoices, or sort of fraudulent invoices, or perhaps to enable a future cyber attack, perhaps on a larger scale. We're seeing things like ransomware attacks where organizations, perhaps somebody has unwittingly brought that malicious software onto the system, and it's caused the charity systems to get locked down. And unfortunately, they then say, we'll give you back access if you pay a ransom. We would obviously always encourage people not to pay that ransom and to contact the police immediately. And what we'll do today is cover some of the defences that can be used, but in the context of a wider sort of risk management approach. Because what we covered in webinar 2 was the Cybersecurity Small Charity Guide. And that has 5 areas that really every charity, regardless of their size, should be doing to protect themselves from cyber attacks. They're sort of really simple, easy, and either free or low cost steps that any charity can take. And today we're going to build upon that. Some of the steps are the same or very similar, but obviously with this being based around our guidance called 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, if nothing else, it's 5 more than the Small Charity Guide, but it definitely goes into a lot more depth and is much more based around charities deciding what bits they want to focus on, and responding to the kind of risk profile that they've set for their organization, and where they're willing to take risks and where they want to minimize those even more. So with that in mind, we'll move on to today's content. So the first step within 10 Steps to Cybersecurity is setting what that risk management regime looks like. And that, first and foremost, requires you to kind of understand what your charity's information and systems look like. And we often coin it as look out for what your crown jewels are. What do you care about most as an organization? And for some, that will be their database. It might be if they're perhaps a medical charity, they will hold intellectual property in a lot of cases. It might be simply if they're perhaps a trust, it will be the money that they have to donate to other causes. It might be, many types of things. And really that's for your board and your senior management to decide what those things are that they care about the most, and make some informed decisions about how much they want to protect those. It's a very similar process that most charities will go through with their sort of legal requirements, perhaps regulatory considerations, and the processes for managing financial risk, whether that's the risk of fraud, right through to making sure there's actually enough money in the bank at the end of the month. Once you've assessed kind of what that information you or perhaps systems you care about most is, you need to understand what the risks to those are. So for example, our threat assessment talks about where cyber criminals are most focused on sort of attacking and what they're after. Normally the ultimate goal is obviously money. That is what they're there to try and steal. So using that threat assessment, you can assess where you want to focus your efforts. Once you've kind of got those two things, it's then important to make sure that risk management regime is embedded across the charity. And a lot of the time, this is where we see cybersecurity in an organization fall down. It's often been seen the reserve of the technical community, the IT team, and actually is sort of seen as a little bit of a box ticking exercise by some senior management and trustee boards. For a risk management regime to be really successful, as within the sort of financial and regulatory space, cybersecurity needs to be taken on by the trustees, really considered as a risk that could affect the whole organization. And that kind of culture, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute, should really be led by the board and the senior management, so that everybody knows what their responsibilities are within that. Moving on from kind of setting that initial risk management regime, and I should say, as we go through this, is going to be a fairly whistle-stop tour through the 10 steps to cybersecurity. The full guidance is available on our website, including individual steps and sort of spring-off guidance that perhaps will help you on individual areas, is available on our website, and the link will be at the end of this webinar. So within the 10 steps, the first one is obviously setting up that risk management regime. What I'm now going to go through is kind of the 9 areas that will help you embed that risk management regime and give you areas to focus on. The first of which is quite simply network security. You need to ensure that your networks are protected from attacks. And in some cases, this will be simple things like making sure that you've changed all of the default passwords on your hardware. Your users have strong passwords, and we'll come on to user education and awareness in a second. It will involve having firewalls set up and configured securely, antivirus where appropriate on kind of all of your devices. There's various steps that 10 steps will go through to help you know which bits you should be focusing on depending on what it is that you're trying to protect the most. Defending the network perimeter is obviously key, because the idea is to not have things getting into your network in the first place. And there is some sort of technical solutions to this. Most software will come with security controls built into it. And when you're particularly setting up cloud, there will be various levels that you can set in terms of the security and how you want to defend your charity. As I said before, firewalls and antivirus will assist you in that. Assuming that somebody is trying to commit a cyber attack against you, being able to filter out that kind of unauthorized access is really important. So you might want to consider, we saw this recently with a charity, you might want to consider whether you have staff working abroad, and if not, do you want to let your systems be accessed from abroad? So that's really simple to do in terms of being able to filter out IP addresses that are able to access your organization, perhaps your cloud email system or something like that, and making sure that everybody who logs into the systems is doing so with a username and password, and ideally, if you can log in remotely, 2-factor authentication as well. And a lot of the time, the final step here is forgotten, which is testing those security controls. It's all well and good thinking that people have set things up, and often as people move on, things are kind of just assumed. So having fairly regular penetration testing on your systems will help you know where there are gaps, where you need to focus on, but also where you've actually got it right already. And those penetration testing providers are out there. There's a lot that we certify as part of our certification schemes. And you can sort of instruct those, they'll do a report for you, and it will just make sure that you know what is available to you and what you can do to make sure you're a bit more secure. Just moving on then to user education and awareness. Just trying to get the slide to move to the next one. There we go. User education and awareness. So one of the key things for any organization is its users. For a long time, I think users have often been considered the weak link in cybersecurity. They're the people that have often been blamed for clicking on those links, downloading malicious software. As the NCSC, we're really keen that we move away from that and actually move to a world where users are in fact the strongest link. They are your last line of security from something being able to get onto the network in the first place. So it's really important to enable your users to actually know what to do if they receive perhaps a phishing email, know how to set strong passwords, and know where to report things if it looks like it's going, if it looks like something bad has happened. So there's a couple of steps here. The first of which is produce some user security policies. And sort of supporting documents so that users know exactly what they should be doing, shouldn't be doing, and actually what they can turn to the IT team for support on. This just helps you kind of have a baseline of what your users should and shouldn't be doing, and everybody knows where they stand. The next step, and I cannot emphasize this one enough, is training your staff, your trustees, your volunteers on how to use the system securely. Often those training sessions are also incredibly useful for the IT team to understand where people are struggling to use the systems in a secure way, perhaps because they need, they're sharing usernames and passwords amongst the team because there aren't enough to go around. Or you might find that actually they're really struggling to log in from home and are finding workarounds to the security systems, which is actually opening up the organization to additional risks there. But having that staff training and really encouraging users to take sensible steps and know what to do if things go wrong would absolutely help your organization in becoming that much more secure. And once that kind of initial staff training, a lot of people do it perhaps at their induction or within sort of the first month, maintaining that consistent awareness of the cyber risks within your organization and your staff will just help sort of stay on top of those emerging cyber attacks or things that perhaps the organization, as it moves to new systems, the users need to be aware of and know what to do with. So making sure that actually it's not just, do the training once and be done with it, but actually there are sort of regular intervals, perhaps, running your own webinars for your staff, or making it a mandatory kind of yearly renewal of the sort of cybersecurity training within your charity will help you just keep that user education and awareness up to scratch. The next section is around removable media. Now, a lot of organizations, and we're seeing it increasingly in the charity sector, are moving to the cloud. Now, this moving to the cloud obviously reduces the need to use removable media at all, because you don't need USB drives or sort of portable hard drives or anything like that, because a lot of the time it can just be put onto the cloud system and you can access it wherever you are and whenever you need it, whether that's working from home, out and about doing presentations, talking to supporters. It's there when you need it. However, we do accept that in a lot of charities, there is still a need to use things like USB sticks, but those carry a risk because they're one of the easiest and sort of most traditional ways to get malicious software onto a network. So the first step that every charity should really be taking here is set a policy for how removable media should be used within the organization. Now, it might be that you actually want to put a complete ban on USB sticks because you've moved to the cloud and there's no sort of sensible reason for them anymore. If there is a need for them, it's just about setting really sensible parameters for how they should be used, perhaps only using approved ones by the charity. So giving your staff perhaps encrypted USB drives if they're going to be moving data about. And just making sure that policy is properly communicated with staff, as we know from the user education and awareness piece. Limiting the types in use, that sort of falls out of that as well. So are you only going to allow certain types of devices rather than all of them? And again, are they only going to be your approved ones? And then from the technical side is making sure that whenever somebody plugs a new USB device into their laptop or desktop computer, that drive gets scanned for malicious software. That's really key because, unless you're actually going to physically stop the USB ports from working on everybody's laptops, there will still be some people that will put a USB drive in thinking they're doing the right thing, or, in some cases trying to find a workaround to a problem. So making sure that it's scanned for malicious software, and if it does pick something up, that doesn't come onto your network is really key. And there's a lot of antivirus providers out there, some of which I know are available on the TT Exchange that will scan for that for you, which will definitely help just add that extra layer of protection. The next step is around secure configuration. So I mentioned earlier when it comes to network security, making sure that you have a secure configuration for your network. There's a couple of quite simple steps to do here. The first of which is applying the security updates, or sometimes called patches, as soon as possible when they become available. Now, not every organization can just install and push out those updates as soon as they come in from, say, Microsoft or other providers, because they may, the changes that have been made in those security updates might affect your other software that you're working on. But having a policy for how quickly you will have tested those on the system and then push them out is really key. And perhaps even making that kind of sticking to that policy a KPI for the IT team. I sort of, whenever I talk about this, I go back to the WannaCry attack in 2017 now. So actually we're getting on a while from it. The security update for that had been pushed out about 56 days before the cyber attack actually happened. So anyone who actually was affected by that was primarily because the software update or patch hadn't been installed on their systems. It was sort of widely reported as the NHS being one of the biggest victims, and that's because they have quite complex IT systems with all of the scanners and X-ray machines that are attached, so they needed a bit more time. But I think that attack has really highlighted how important it is to make sure those security updates are installed as soon as possible. Understanding what the secure configuration of your devices is. So where you're giving your staff and your volunteers and trustees perhaps their own IT, so a work laptop, for instance, knowing how to sort of put the most secure configuration onto that, and it will depend on the device and the software that you're using. But having a baseline, it's called a sort of baseline build for when you give that to people. So for example, it will have the following controls on it. Staff won't be able to download their own software. They'll need to get that through IT, that kind of thing, and making sure that when that baseline is decided, that is stuck to on all the devices that are given out to staff and users is absolutely key. Partly because actually if something goes wrong, it means you always know where you need to revert back to. And building out from that, having an inventory of all of the devices and assets that you have on your network, and a standard operating procedure for giving out new devices. So, only giving access to things to people that need it is really key in helping you stick to that secure configuration. And the same is also true of any new software that you put on people's systems. So, for example, giving people each their own username and passwords, and allowing them obviously to set a strong password themselves will make sure that people aren't sharing passwords and opening up the system to potential attacks. So building out of that quite neatly comes managing user privileges. So there's a question here for I suppose senior management really, which is how much access do staff or volunteers need to do their job? So for example, it's generally considered that not every staff member is going to need access to every system and the sort of higher levels of access in a lot of cases. So for example, if somebody doesn't actually need access to the supporter database or beneficiary database, should they really be given access to it in the first place? And the reason we say this is, if a sort of piece of malicious software or a virus or something does get into your system, limiting how far it can go from any one individual user account is absolutely key, because that will just limit the damage that gets caused and ultimately the amount of effort and cleanup that's required to recover from that attack. So it's probably worth coming up at this point with some sort of matrix. So depending on different role profiles, they're automatically given different access. And people would need to then request access with a really clear business case for how they need to use it and why it's essential for their job in order for IT to be able to give them any additional accesses to software or new devices and things like that. Very much in line with that is limiting the number of admin accounts. So these are the administrator accounts that the IT team and system administrators will use. They should only be given to people who are absolutely doing kind of, essential work on the networks and really know what they're doing with an administrator account. And actually very linked with that, those people should actually have two accounts. One is their general user account that they use for kind of day-to-day work within the charity. So for example, reading their emails, surfing the web. and then a separate account to do their administration duties from. The reason we say that is if somebody clicks on a dodgy link or downloads some malicious software from an email on an administrator account, it effectively gives that malicious software completely unfettered access to the network, and they can really go a lot further from there. If they're accessing it just from a generic user account, it's much more limited and will generally be controlled in how far it can go before somebody catches on. And the final thing to say here is monitor user activity. And I know for some organizations, this can be a little bit uncomfortable. It's not a case of sort of monitoring things like, what people are actually doing on their computer in terms of keeping tabs on them. But it's about setting monitoring for different pieces of software, where those login requests are coming from. Are people downloading a lot more data from the system than they would normally do within their day job? And having those audit logs that can be checked and making sure that that is a real priority for the IT team to check those and make sure that anything out of the ordinary is investigated. Now, usually it will just be that somebody perhaps, changed roles or something like that, and it won't come to anything. But those regular checks mean that actually you'll be able to see where things are going wrong, and you can start to build up a pattern so sort of what looks right and what doesn't, and that will really help when trying to spot cyber attacks that are happening. Mobile and home working. So people, are increasingly out of the office now, but also taking their IT with them now, whether that's their work laptop perhaps, or their phone, tablet, something like that. We're seeing it an awful lot more. And obviously home working, on the whole actually saves organizations money because they don't need as many desks and things like that. So it's well worth doing. And there's some sensible precautions that can be taken to make sure that, your data and your organization is well protected with users doing that. The first of which is to decide on a mobile working policy. And that will sort of cover things like what bits of IT people can take home, what systems you're allowing people to access remotely, and what you expect of your users in doing so. For example, when they take their laptop out of the building, it should be turned off properly so that all of the password authentication comes into play, that kind of thing. And once you've got that policy, making sure that your staff and volunteers are trained on how to do that safely. So if people are going to be working at home regularly, you've probably done a DSE assessment for them or got them to complete a homework, a DSE assessment. The same should be true really of their IT equipment as well. So making sure that, they know what they're doing, and you can be assured actually that you're doing sort of mobile and home working in the safest way. And where people are leaving the office, there is that increased risk of sort of data either being stolen because somebody's laptop is physically being stolen. So ensuring that you've got encryption on that laptop at rest, so when it's not being used, so somebody couldn't literally just take the hard drive out and potentially steal the contents of the charity's database, but also in transit. So simply meaning while it's moving from someone's laptop to the internet or back into the charity's network. And that can be done in a lot of cases by something like a VPN. And a lot of the times people will use VPNs anyway to allow people to access those systems back in the office. But there's some really sort of sensible steps within the 10 steps to cybersecurity about sensible precautions you can take to protect data both in transit and at rest, which I definitely encourage you to have a look at if you're allowing your users to work from home or work while they're out and about. The next sort of phase of 10 steps is the monitoring piece. And that is very similar to the user monitoring, but it's actually much broader than that. So it's being able to monitor all of the traffic that is coming in and out of your charity, deciding which bits you want to monitor closely. So is that, for example, people accessing from remotely? Are you more worried about perhaps people accessing the wrong things from within the charity? And deciding based on what your crown jewels are, which bits you're most keen to monitor. And and make sure that you're then continuously monitoring all of those systems and networks. There's a lot of automatic monitoring that can be bought now increasingly for quite reasonable prices, and that will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and produce logs or alerts when things fall out of the ordinary kind of pattern of events. And particularly true that where people are perhaps accessing it from other countries, it will, you can almost guarantee, happen outside of Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and those systems will then have the ability to alert you outside of office hours if something does look odd, and allow you to investigate it. And as I said earlier, when it came to managing user privileges, making sure that there's a really clear process for analysing those logs for that unusual activity. And often that's just a case of, perhaps once a day or once a week, sitting down and going through those logs to kind of identify what looks out of normal, sort of outside of the normal pattern, and being able to then investigate that either by just getting in touch with the users whose accounts have perhaps been accessed remotely outside of the norm, and making sure that was them and just explaining to them sort of why you're getting in touch with them. But obviously, of course, not blaming them for just trying to do their job in those cases, but it will help you pick up incidents occurring. And actually, one of the things that obviously monitoring will then help you do is respond to incidents much more quickly. But there is a few steps that you need to take within incident management, the first of which is establish a plan with how you're going to deal with an incident. Now, no incident is the same, so you will need to have quite a broad plan that covers a lot of eventualities. And that might be really simply responding to perhaps one person downloading a piece of malicious software onto one laptop. That's contained. What do you do with it then? Because you can guarantee that person's going to be pretty panicked, but will also want to get back to work. So how are you going to respond to that and make sure that you're reducing the downtime for the organization as much as possible? From there, you'll also need to look at much wider incidents. So perhaps the entire network has been ransomware and you can't get into anything. Considering little things like, say something like that does happen, or even perhaps the server gets completely flooded and the office is out of action, how do you contact people outside of hours? Quite often incident response plans will say, we will email all of the people who need to be involved in the incident, and that works fine unless you've been stopped from being able to access your email address and people being able to access those remotely. So considering little scenarios like that. From there, and I can't emphasize this one enough again, is test your incident response plan. We recently, just 2 weeks ago, launched something called Exercise in a Box. And this is a series of 5 exercises. Some are tabletop, some are more technical exercises where you can actually put a sort of fake piece of code into your system and allow your IT team to go hunting for it. But those scenarios have been created based out of real incident reports, and we'll test how you respond from everything from what's the leadership's role in it, because you can guarantee that leadership will want to know what's going on in the case of an incident, what the IT team's role is, how you're going to communicate with users, at what point do you need to involve outside parties. So I'd really encourage everyone who's got that incident response plan in place to go and test it using our Exercise in a Box program. It's available on our website. It's currently on the home page with it being released quite recently. And it's free to use for everybody. You just need to set up an account and you're ready to go. And the final thing I would say around incident management is make sure that you're reporting your incidents to Action Fraud, the Information Commissioner's Office if necessary. And obviously if you've got banks or things like that that you feel you need to report to, making sure it's reported to them. We only know what trends are appearing with cyber incidents because of the reports we get from members of the public and charities and businesses alike. So please do report those through Action Fraud, and it just helps us be able to respond to kind of those emerging trends and put out guidance that's really relevant to organisations. So I just sort of began mentioning this within incident management, but knowing what to do if you do fall victim is key. And what's on your slide now is actually a kind of chronological, in most cases, order of who you should report to. So Obviously, if it's a financial one and is affecting your bank accounts, your bank or building society or whatever it might be will obviously be your first step. But in terms of sort of a law enforcement and government response, reporting to action fraud is what will kick off any police response to it. And it's also where we get our taskings from if an incident is considered of a national importance for us to get involved in. A little bit of a sort of nuance with Scotland, because Police Scotland is sort of different force. If you're actually based up there, or if the incident is predominantly up there, it's important that you just report to Police Scotland through 101. The Information Commissioner's Office, obviously with GDPR, you've got that 72-hour window to report if it's a data breach that is could affect people's rights and freedoms. So making sure you do that within that time frame. The Charity Commission have their serious incident reporting. Now, that's not one you need to do at that very moment in time, but making sure that you do that as soon as possible once you know what the impact on your charity will be. Just doing that kind of proactive reporting will make sure that their sort of regulatory response is as good as possible for you, and you've given them as much information as they need. And within the sector, we're also being sort of increasingly told that some other regulators, if you're in a sort of part of the charity sector that perhaps is doing government contracts or healthcare or things like that, you might need to notify those kind of regulators. And some trusts that are funding charities want to know if there's something that might affect their ability to continue as an organisation. Perhaps if it was a cyber attack that caused you to lose a reasonably significant amount of money, you might need to let other funders know. So it's just worth knowing as part of your incident management plan who it is you should be reporting to, and what it is that you're kind of asking from them or letting them know about. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the things I've talked about today are actually available through the TT Exchange. So that's the program that's run by Tech Trust, which gives sort of up to 90%, 96% discounts on many of the kind of products. So the antiviruses that we've talked about, the cloud packages, and in some cases, sort of additional firewall type products and things like that. So please do check that out, and particularly if you're sort of looking at increasing new bits of software on your system. That's kind of it for a very whistle-stop tour of 10 steps. I'd really encourage everybody kind of listening to have a look at the full guidance, and it goes into quite a lot of detail on each of those 10 steps to help you develop that risk management regime, and certainly more than we can cover in sort of an hour-long webinar. So please do have a look at that. I think there's been quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to pass back to Jonathan to compare those for the next sort of 15-20 minutes or so.
Thank you, Cal. There's some really great content there. Immediate takeaways that I took were obviously there's nine areas of focus, which I think gives a nice structured approach. I really like the change in emphasis on users, moving away from viewing them as a weakness to actually treating them as as part of your line of defence.
Absolutely.
And really interesting to hear about the exercise in a box, which has certainly stimulated some interest. And
great.
Just for the people online, we will publicise the link to that directly when we send around our information after the end of the webinar. So let's cut into questions. If you haven't yet logged one, then please do so. It's really simple. Just click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and then type it away. First question I'm going to go to. So this is about fraud. So do people have to actually report an attempted fraud, or is it only if it's been a successful attack that they have to report it?
So it's a bit of a slightly grey area. So there is actually no legal requirement for anyone to report fraud to the police. You don't have a duty to report, but obviously we would always encourage people to report, frauds, and in kind of the context of the question, those attempted frauds. If you've been, prepared enough to avoid that actually being successful, you can't guarantee the next charity or business that they try will be quite as prepared, and particularly where we then see a trend of perhaps, I don't know, just for argument's sake, an HMRC tax refund type fraud, where we start to see a trend of those, and including the attempted ones but not successful. Action Fraud can then get out alerts through sort of social media, their email lists, through the local police forces and things like that, which will just bring it to people's attention. Hopefully, in those cases, it will then still be an attempted fraud and people won't actually be defrauded. You can obviously report both cybercrime and fraud, and it's quite difficult sometimes to separate those two increasingly, because a lot of the time it will be a cyber attack, like a phishing email, that will enable a different type of more traditional fraud, like bank mandate fraud, for example. So Action Fraud is absolutely the place to go. But obviously, if you're getting a lot of attempted frauds, it might be worth reporting those all at once rather than every time something gets through. But as you kind of report those, it just helps inform the intelligence that allows us to do those alerts ahead of time to stop other people falling victim.
Okay, good. And really early on, you talked about network penetration testing providers. Where can people find a list of those? So
they're on our website. So if you go to ncsc.gov.uk, and I can send the full link that gets people straight to this afterwards, I think, with the follow-up. But we have a certification scheme, and what we do is we certify providers which sort of fall to a very stringent criteria about how they do those reports, the kind of reporting that you'll get back from it, and also kind of the tools that they will use to penetrate your systems. And it's often sometimes called white hat hacking. So it's kind of the good guys trying to test it. So you might have heard it called that before as well. But that full list of providers is there. We obviously as government can't recommend people, but what we're saying there is, we have sort of tested these organizations. They've fallen within certain criteria just to make sure that they really are doing a good job, and you can sort of have some faith that they will do a good job for your charity. So we'll make sure we send it afterwards, but that's on our website under the products and services section.
Brilliant. Right, going to another one. So obviously larger charities will tend to have dedicated IT, and I think you maybe referred to IT teams a bit through this webinar. There are obviously some smaller charities online who don't have dedicated IT teams. So I've got a question from one of those, and they're basically saying, what areas should they prioritise? Because obviously, if you're a general manager or something, you're probably covering 100 different tasks. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, kind of for those smaller charities that don't have a dedicated IT resource, whether that's one person or a whole team, to focus on the Small Charity Guide. And that's available literally on that link that's on your screen at the moment. And that focuses on 5 areas, some of which are sort of expanded upon in the 10 steps that we've covered today. But those 5 areas are around, really simple steps to protect from malware. So putting on antivirus, making sure it's turned on and on all the time that the devices are turned on, making sure that the firewalls that come with the devices in a lot of cases are turned on as well. Passwords, I really can't emphasize enough how much passwords, and where possible, 2-factor authentication, which for anyone that isn't familiar with it is very similar to what you do when you now log into bank accounts, where it will make you put in username and password, and then you have to put in a separate code that's perhaps come through to your mobile device or something like that. The same sort of software is now available on most cloud email. It's available on social media. Pretty much most online services now offer 2-factor authentication. And as a small charity, absolutely, that should be one of the first places to start. But also, the same as much larger charities, the user education and awareness piece is absolutely key, because making sure that they are supporting the organization in their drive for kind of a more secure charity is definitely going to help in the long run. It's also worth mentioning that the last webinar you did with us in March was also actually on these 5 steps.
Was.
So if you prefer to consume your material through the webinar means rather than reading the guide, that's another way to get into more content on this.
Yes.
Going to another topic. Actually, this is going back to the fraud reporting. I think this is a fairly common type of situation. So sometimes somebody phones up. In this example here, it's somebody pretending to be from BT, but I think people sometimes say they're from Microsoft, any big shiny corporate that sounds plausible. And they say they're trying to remotely connect to the PC to fix a problem. Should that be reported as well? That type of incident?
Yeah, absolutely. Because sadly, those are really common. In fact, literally the other day, I had one from someone pretending to be a well-known broadband provider calling me at home and wanting to help me fix my internet, which I knew was working because I was watching Netflix at the time. So, and they weren't from the provider that I know that I use. But yes, absolutely. Reporting those is equally important. You can do it through. So, Action Forward have a number of ways to report. You can either do it through a really quick online form. I've done it myself. You can, if it's a simple report like that, you can get through it pretty much in about sort of a couple of minutes, something like that. Or if it's a bit more complex and you don't want to do it through an online form because perhaps you want a bit of advice at the same time, you can do it over the phone. But one of the key things, if you're going to report something like that, is making sure you give Action Forward the phone number that it shows as coming from, if it's available. I know sometimes they'll block their number or something like that. But just in terms of advice, should that actually happen to anyone, what we'd always say is those kind of companies don't ring you up unsolicited and tell you there's a problem with your internet and that they want you to log into something or give them passwords or anything like that. So should you get one of those calls, even if something is a bit awry with your internet, tell them, thank you very much for telling you, hang up and then call the company that you normally talk to direct from a number that you know is correct, either from their own website or perhaps your bill that you get through, something like that. And ideally off a different phone, because we have had it in the past, particularly with landlines, where the fraudsters at the other end will keep that line open. So when you think you're ringing back to, in this case, BT, you're actually just now talking to them again, and the sort of fraud is still there. So it's definitely just worth getting back in touch with them through a means that you know to be correct.
Yeah, good advice there. So there's still time if people want to log more questions as well. I've got a couple more in front of me here. So you talked about turning off laptops when people leave. I guess with modern SSDs, they do boot quicker than they used to, but it's still a little bit tedious to cold boot a laptop. So the tendency is to still just hit that button and suspend it. Certainly on some machines, that does still require you to go through, putting in your credentials again, be a password or a PIN to get back in. So why could you just elaborate more on why you were recommending turning them off then, and why just that suspend with the re-entry password isn't sufficient?
So in a lot of cases it can be, and it will, going back to kind of the secure configuration piece, whenever somebody is away from their desk for any period of time, obviously you want people to be locking their screens whenever they go away from their device anyway, but there should also be the functionality that if they go away and don't touch it for say 5 minutes or so, it automatically locks and requires a password to go back in. The reason we say turn it off completely when it's out of the office is if you've got so boot level encryption on the hard drive, that is often only enabled from when it's actually turned off completely and powered down. So if you have got that enabled, and there's some advice on that within 10 steps, in fact, about the protecting data at rest piece, it may only click on if you've actually turned it off properly. So if the device was stolen, people could still access some of the things from the hard drive without being able to use the laptop. So if you do have that enabled, having it turned off when you leave the office is definitely key.
Okay. And going back to USB sticks, and I'm kind of conscious that sometimes old habits are hard to break. So maybe people have been doing that for years, they just keep doing it. Wouldn't you say that now in this day and age of the cloud, if you are using the cloud, then really 90% of the time you probably don't need to use a USB stick at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, if you're using the cloud, and I know it's still a transition for some people, like you say, people who've been using USB sticks for a very long time. The only time I think really that there is, that obvious justification for still using that kind of older technology is if you're a charity operating in areas with quite poor internet signal, or perhaps 3G or 4G connection on a mobile device. You might not actually be able to download things from the cloud. And we did get that feedback from a small charity operating, I think, in East Anglia a while ago, where the internet signal just isn't fast enough to keep that constant update of the cloud. That sort of scenario is obviously a bit of an exception, but really in this day and age and moving to the cloud, the use of USB should be very limited, and it should be a sort of case by exception rather than by the rule.
Yeah, okay. And we've got a question here from Lauren, who's saying they've been advised that the antivirus malware built into Microsoft using Office 365 is sufficient. Yeah. She just wanted to check that is the case.
Yeah, so absolutely. For the vast majority of organisations, as long as you're not defending against some pretty persistent attackers, will be absolutely fine. The key there, and we've actually got some guidance on the secure configuration for Office 365 on our website. I can send that again as a link afterwards. The key is just making sure that it's configured correctly and in the most secure way for your organisation. So obviously going back to the crown jewels piece, there'll be some things you want to protect more. And as I said earlier about, sort of the security on things by default, you might need to put in place some additional controls. So I think this is still the case, but I may be wrong. I'm happy to be corrected. Things like, for example, two-factor authentication on Office 365 isn't turned on as standard for users. So the securest configuration would be to have that turned on. Making sure that you're actually turning that on and configuring Office 365 securely should make it absolutely fine for the majority of charities.
Good. That'd be very helpful. And earlier we were talking about the penetration testing suppliers. Also had a similar question because you were talking about monitoring software suppliers. Do you have a list of those somewhere?
We do have an assurance scheme for that kind of software. It is on our website. I would probably in this case be slightly hesitant to recommend it for the charity sector. The reason being NCSE more traditionally is akin to protecting large government departments and things like that. I think probably the types of software that we've accredited on the monitoring side are probably a bit over the top for most charities. Yes. But what I can do is afterwards, if Jonathan and I have a chat, we'll see what's available through TT Exchange and see what is on our system, because I can't remember them all off the top of my head now, but we'll make sure we send a link to something appropriate to help organisations choose that afterwards.
Okay, good, thank you. And we've managed to answer all of the questions today, which I think is the first time across our 3 sessions we've managed to cover them all.
Absolutely.
So that's good. So I'd really like to thank you for your time today, Chubb. Really interesting and insightful session. As I said at the outset, this has been recorded, and so we will be putting this live online in the next week. I do also need to make an apology, because we had a bit of feedback to say there was some fluctuating sound levels at the start of the webinar. On our voyage of looking to increase the quality of what we're doing, we actually used a new microphone this week with the aim of actually increasing the quality. But clearly there's a few lessons for us to learn in terms of how we bed that down and tune it in. But I hope that the quality did improve as it went along, and that there aren't subsequent issues in further webinars as well. But that's all we got time for. I do want to make a quick plug for the delightful webinar next week on leveraging the power of personalization in social media. I know that social media is an incredibly important topic to a lot of charities in terms of how you reach out to your audiences. So this is going to look at what I think is a real key topic for how you can actually gain more engagement with your audiences through social media. In terms of contacting us overall, all the details are here on the last screen as well. And if you want to keep up to date on our future webinars, you can sign up at the URL tech-trust.org /2019 webinars series. So do please do that as well. So that's all we want to say time for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you join us for more of our sessions in the near future. Thank you and goodbye.